The dust tasted of endings. It coated Annalise Vogel's tongue, a fine grit of pulverized hopes that had been stirred up across 3 states and a territory. She drew her son, Peter, closer against her hip, his small, warm body a singular anchor in a world that had dissolved around them. Before them, the Blackwood Ranch sprawled under the vast, indifferent blue of the Montana sky, a collection of weathered gray buildings that seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next blow from the wind or from fate. She had dropped her 2 worn carpetbags on the dirt, the sound a dull thud of finality. This was it. The last name on a list, the final dollar in her reticule, the end of the line. A man emerged from the largest structure, a barn that leaned as if weary of standing. He moved with a limp that was not the shuffle of old age but the rigid gait of remembered pain. His face was a landscape of its own, carved by sun and worry, with eyes the gray of creek stones after a hard rain. He stopped a dozen paces away, his gaze sweeping over her, then her son, then the pathetic luggage. It was a look that held no welcome, only assessment. A rancher's look, weighing livestock for worth. "This is private property," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Annalise did not flinch. She had faced down creditors, condescending station masters, and the hollow pity of distant relatives. A grim-faced rancher was just another locked door. "I know," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. Her accent, a soft echo of the Netherlands, seemed out of place in the sharp air. "I am looking for Mr. Silas Blackwood." "You found him," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not hiring, and I'm not in the business of charity." She had expected this, hoped for it in a way. Charity was a currency she did not possess and did not want. Work was different. Work was her steel spine. "I do not seek charity, Mr. Blackwood. I seek employment." A dry, humorless sound, almost a cough, escaped him. "As what? A ranch hand?" He gestured vaguely at her worn but respectable traveling dress. "We're a cattle operation, ma'am, not a finishing school." "I am a governess by training," she said, ignoring the barb. "But my skills are more varied than that title suggests. I can cook, I can clean, I can manage household accounts, take inventory, and mend clothing. I am methodical, I am tidy, and I am not afraid of labor. My son and I require only room and board. You will not find a more cost-effective solution to your domestic needs." She delivered the words like a barrister making a final argument, a direct and honest statement of her value. She did not plead. She proposed. Silas Blackwood just stared. He looked at the cattle milling in a distant corral. He looked at the silent, wide-eyed boy clinging to her skirts. He looked at Annalise, at the exhaustion etched around her eyes but the unbroken line of her jaw. He had seen desperate people before. They whined, they begged, they told sob stories. This woman stated facts. It was unsettling. Just as he was about to send her on her way, because a woman and child were the last complication his struggling ranch needed, the door to the small cookhouse burst open. A burly, red-faced man stumbled out, waving a half-empty bottle. "I quit Blackwood," he bellowed. "Done cooking for this ungrateful outfit. Find someone else to burn the beans." He threw the bottle against the side of the bunkhouse, where it shattered with a sharp, ugly crack. Then he staggered off toward the main track, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Several hands, who had been lounging near the bunkhouse, looked from the departing cook to Silas, their expressions a mixture of amusement and apprehension. Supper was in 2 hours. Annalise did not move. She did not even seem to blink. Her gaze remained fixed on Silas, her expression unchanged. It was as if the universe had conspired to provide her with an audition. Silas rubbed a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the sudden quiet. He felt the familiar throb in his hip, a souvenir from a long-ago stampede. He was tired. Tired of unreliable help, tired of mounting debts, tired of the relentless grinding pressure of keeping this place afloat. He looked at the cookhouse, a place he now knew would be a disaster of spilled flour and rancid bacon fat. He looked at the woman. "You can cook?" he asked, the words tasting like surrender. "Yes," she said simply. He gestured with his chin toward the disgraced cookhouse. "Supper for 8 men, in 2 hours. If they eat it without complaint, you and the boy can sleep in the supply wagon for the night. We'll see about the rest in the morning. It was not an offer of employment. It was a challenge, a stay of execution. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Annalise said, the first hint of warmth entering her voice. She bent down, her movements economical and sure, and picked up her bags. "Peter," she murmured to her son in Dutch, a stream of soft, reassuring sounds. The boy looked up at the grim rancher, his eyes huge and dark, but he did not make a sound. He simply took his mother's hand as she walked toward the cookhouse, her back straight, her stride purposeful. She was a ship, damaged but not sunk, catching a new and unexpected wind. Silas watched her go, a strange feeling churning in his gut. He had just invited a fox into his henhouse, a complication he could not afford. But as she disappeared inside the ramshackle building, he couldn't shake the image of her standing there in the dust, proud and unbroken. He'd made a wager, not on her cooking, but on her character. And Silas Blackwood, for the first time in a long time, was not entirely sure he wanted to win. Later that night, long after the men had eaten in a state of stunned, satisfied silence, Silas limped toward the supply wagon. A faint light glowed from within. He'd expected to find her awake, waiting for his verdict. The meal had been astonishing. Not fancy, but deeply, elementally good. A simple beef stew, but the meat was tender, the broth rich with herbs she must have found growing wild near the creek. The biscuits were light and flaky, a universe away from the hardtack pucks the former cook, drunk or sober, had called food. Even Frank, his most cantankerous hand, had eaten 2 platefuls without a word of his usual grumbling. He reached the wagon and peered over the side. The lantern was turned down low, casting a soft golden light. Annalise was not waiting for him. She was asleep, slumped on a pile of canvas tarps, her head resting on a sack of flour. One arm was draped protectively around her son, who was curled against her side, his small face peaceful in sleep for the first time in what looked like weeks. Her own face, in repose, had lost its sharp, defensive lines. The exhaustion was still there, a pale shadow beneath her skin. But it was the exhaustion of labor honorably done, not the frayed nerve weariness of despair. She looked settled. She looked for all the world like she belonged there. Silas stood motionless in the cool night air, the scent of sagebrush sharp around him. He had built walls around his heart after his wife, Martha, had been taken by the fever 5 years prior. They were high, thick walls, mortared with grief and cynicism. He'd learned the hard way that hope was a liability and trust was a fool's game. He ran his ranch on principles of grim necessity and cold arithmetic. Yet looking at the Dutch governess and her silent boy asleep in his wagon, a small, quiet life tucked into the corner of his harsh world, he felt something shift inside him. A stone, long wedged in the foundation of his defenses, loosened. It wasn't a collapse. It was just a tremor, a subtle recognition that the orderly, empty fortress he had constructed might not be as impenetrable as he had believed. He pulled a thick wool blanket from a nearby stack, shook it out, and gently draped it over them, his movements clumsy and unpracticed. He did not know her name was Annalise. He did not know her son was Peter. He only knew that for the first time since Martha's passing, the silence of his ranch felt less like emptiness and more like peace. The following morning broke clear and cold, the sun a pale disk over the eastern ridges. The men of the Blackwood Ranch rose with the light, their movements sluggish with habit. They shuffled toward the cookhouse, expecting the usual grim reality, a smoky room, a cold stove, and the lingering smell of yesterday's failure. Instead, they were met with the scent of coffee, rich and strong, and baking bread. Annalise was already there, moving through the small, cramped space with an unhurried grace that was mesmerizing to watch. The cookhouse itself was transformed. The greasy film that had coated every surface was gone, scrubbed away to the bare wood. The chaotic mess of pots and pans had been organized, hanging from newly hammered nails in clean, orderly rows. A stack of freshly washed plates gleamed on a shelf that had, only yesterday, been shrouded in cobwebs. She had risen before dawn, fueled by a night of dreamless restorative sleep, and imposed order on the chaos. It was not a performance for their benefit, it was an expression of her fundamental nature. For Annalise Vogel, order was a form of prayer. She wore a simple apron over her dress and had her honey-blonde hair pinned up neatly, stray wisps catching the morning light. She nodded a polite good morning to the men as they filed in, their faces a study in disbelief. She gestured to a platter of thick sliced bacon and a bowl of scrambled eggs on the long trestle table. Beside it sat a basket piled high with warm golden brown biscuits. It was a breakfast fit for a celebration, not a Tuesday on a ranch teetering on the edge of ruin. The men served themselves, their usual rough banter subdued. They sat and ate. The silence was different from the night before. It wasn't just surprise, it was a kind of reverence. Billy, the youngest of the hands at barely 18, with a face full of freckles and earnestness, was the first to speak. "Ma'am," he said, his mouth full of biscuit, "I ain't eaten this good since I left my mother's house." Annalise offered him a small, genuine smile. "I am glad it is to your liking." She turned her attention to her son, Peter, who sat on a small stool near the stove, away from the big men. He was holding a tin cup of milk in both hands, watching everything with his unnervingly silent gaze. Silas entered last, his limp more pronounced in the cold morning air. He took in the scene, the clean room, the quiet men, the astonishing breakfast. His eyes met Annalise's over the steam rising from the coffee pot. He saw no triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." He saw only a quiet question. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The wager was settled. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took a biscuit. It was as good as the ones from the night before. He ate standing by the door, observing. He watched her move, her hands sure and deft as she began gathering ingredients for the midday meal. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. She seemed to know instinctively where everything was. Even in this kitchen she had only inhabited for less than a day. It was competence so profound it was like a physical force. After the men had filed out, replete and in considerably better spirits than usual, Annalise began clearing the table. Silas remained by the door. "The supply wagon is needed in town," he said, his tone flat, businesslike. "You and the boy can have the old foreman's cabin. It's small, but it has a stove and a sound roof." Annalise paused, a stack of plates in her hands. She looked at him, her blue eyes clear and direct. "Is that a permanent offer of employment, Mr. Blackwood?" He considered the question. Permanent was a word he had banished from his vocabulary. Permanent was a lie. Martha was supposed to be permanent. Prosperity was supposed to be permanent. "It's an offer for as long as your cooking keeps the men from quitting," he countered, hedging. "The pay is room and board, as you said. Nothing more for now." "That is acceptable," she said, and returned to her work. The foreman's cabin was little more than a one-room shack set a short distance from the main house, but to Annalise, it was a palace. It had 4 solid walls, a door that latched, and a window that looked out onto the vast, rolling expanse of the valley. While Peter explored the dusty corners with a child's solemn curiosity, Annalise set to work. She swept the floor, scrubbed the small wood stove until the rust gave way to black iron, and washed the single window until the sunlight streamed in clear and bright. She unpacked their few belongings, a change of clothes for each of them, a worn Dutch Bible, Peter's small carved wooden horse, and a packet of letters from her late husband, tied with a faded ribbon. She laid out their thin blankets on the narrow cot, creating a space that was theirs. It was a fragile foothold, a temporary sanctuary, but it was anchored by her own effort. As she worked, she felt a loosening in her own chest, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. For the first time since leaving her failed post back in Ohio, she was not in transit. She was not begging or hiding or running. She was working. She was earning her place. From the porch of his own lonely house, Silas watched her. He saw her beat a dusty rug against the side of the cabin with fierce, rhythmic thumps. He saw her carry bucket after bucket of water from the pump. He saw the smoke begin to curl from the cabin's chimney. He had given her a space, and she was turning it into a home before his very eyes. It was a kind of alchemy he hadn't witnessed since Martha. He pushed the thought away, annoyed at his own sentimentality. The woman was efficient, that's all. It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. But as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard, he saw the light from her window bloom in the twilight. A small, steady flame in the gathering dark. And the iron walls around his own heart felt a little colder, a little more like a prison than a fortress. The days settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. Annalise's presence was a quiet but transformative force. The cookhouse became the undisputed heart of the operation, a warm, clean, orderly space that smelled of baking bread, simmering stews, and strong coffee. The men's morale, long eroded by poor food and the general air of decay, began to improve. They were quieter around her, their language cleaner, their manners a shade more civilized. Young Billy was the first to fully cross the invisible line between employee and ally. He started bringing her small offerings, a handful of wild berries he'd found, a clutch of prairie chicken eggs, a pretty stone for Peter. He would talk to the boy, who still rarely spoke, showing him how to whittle a piece of wood or explaining the names of the different horses. Peter would watch him, his dark eyes absorbing everything, and sometimes a ghost of a smile would touch his lips. Gus, the oldest hand, a man as weathered and silent as the fence posts he mended, became another quiet supporter. He never said much, but after a particularly good meal, he would catch Annalise's eye and give a slow, deliberate nod. Coming from Gus, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. He began leaving a small pile of perfectly split kindling by her cabin door every morning, a silent acknowledgement of her labor, a gesture of respect from one hard worker to another. But not everyone was won over. Frank, a thick-set man with a perpetually sour expression, saw Annalise's competence not as a blessing, but as a disruption. He had been with the ranch for 10 years, comfortable in the predictable mediocrity of the old ways. He missed the lax discipline, the greasy food he could complain about, the easy camaraderie of an all-male environment. Annalise, with her quiet dignity and the subtle changes she wrought, was a reproach to his own inertia. His resentment simmered, surfacing in small, snide remarks made just at the edge of her hearing. He called her the Duchess. He complained that the bread was too soft, the stew too seasoned. "Getting mighty fancy around here," he'd mutter to the other men. "Pretty soon he'll have us wearing neckties to slop the hogs." Most of the men ignored him, their loyalty won over by their full bellies. But Frank's bitterness was a burr under the saddle of the newfound peace. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. It happened during supper one evening. The men were tired after a long day of branding. Annalise had prepared a pot roast, slow-cooked until it fell apart at the touch of a fork, with roasted potatoes and carrots. She was pouring coffee when Frank pushed his plate away with a loud scrape. "Can't a man get a simple plate of beans around here anymore?" he said loudly, his voice oozing belligerence. "I'm a cowhand, not some city fop. Don't need no Dutch hen clucking over me, telling me what to eat." The room went silent. The men stopped eating, their eyes darting from Frank to Annalise. Peter, sitting on his stool, froze, his small body rigid. Annalise was holding the heavy ceramic coffee pot. Her knuckles were white, but her hand was steady. She placed the pot carefully on the stove, the movement deliberate and controlled. She turned to face Frank, her expression unreadable. She did not raise her voice. "The work I do is for Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet room. "If you find my cooking unsatisfactory, perhaps you should address your complaint to him. He is the one who pays my wages." Frank flushed, taken aback by her directness. He had expected her to be flustered, perhaps to cry. He hadn't expected this calm, unshakable dignity. "It ain't about the food," he sneered, getting to his feet, trying to use his size to intimidate her. "It's about a woman thinking she can run this outfit." "I do not run the outfit," Annalise replied, her gaze unwavering. "I run the kitchen, and I run it well. If you would prefer to take over my duties, you are welcome to try." Before Frank could retort, a low voice cut through the tension from the doorway. "Sit down, Frank." It was Silas. He had been standing there for the last minute, watching, listening. His face was like granite. He limped into the room, his presence filling the space. He stopped beside the table, his gaze fixed on the belligerent hand. "She's right," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Her job is to cook. Your job is to work cattle. She is doing her job better than anyone I've had in 5 years. You, on the other hand, seem to have a lot of time for complaining." He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "This is my ranch. I decide who works here and what they do. If you have a problem with the woman I hired, you have a problem with me. Is that clear?" Frank's bluster evaporated under Silas's cold fury. He looked around at the other men, but found no support in their faces. They were looking at their plates, at the ceiling, anywhere but at him. He had overplayed his hand and lost. "Yeah," he mumbled, sinking back onto the bench. "It's clear." "Good," Silas said. He straightened up. "Her name is Mrs. Vogel, and you will show her the respect her work has earned." He looked at Annalise, a long, searching look. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, the only sign of the strain she was under. He saw the fierce, protective pride in her eyes. And he saw Frank's defeat reflected in the subtle relaxing of her shoulders. He had defended her, and in doing so had drawn a line in the sand. She was not just a temporary cook anymore. She was part of his ranch. She was under his protection. "Finish your supper, men," Silas said, his voice returning to its normal gruffness. He turned and walked out, the sound of his uneven footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Annalise took a slow, deep breath and picked up the coffee pot again. She moved to Billy's cup and refilled it, her hand perfectly steady now. The crisis had passed. Her position, once precarious, was now solidified, not by her own actions alone, but by the public, unequivocal support of the one man who mattered. The internal resistance had been met and defeated, and the bond between the capable outsider and the weathered owner had been forged a little stronger, tempered in the fire of a small, necessary conflict. A week after the confrontation with Frank, an uneasy peace settled over the ranch. Frank was sullen but subdued, doing his work without complaint. The other men, witnessing Silas's decisive support, treated Annalise with a new level of deference. She was no longer just the cook. She was an established part of the ranch's hierarchy. Her authority in her domain as absolute as Silas's was in the fields. But Annalise's mind, trained in the meticulous observation of a household, saw things beyond the kitchen. While her hands were busy kneading dough or peeling potatoes, her eyes were always cataloging, her brain always calculating. She had taken over the ordering of supplies, a task Silas had grudgingly relinquished after seeing her impeccable organization of the pantry. He would give her the list, and she would prepare the order for Billy to take into the nearby town of Prospect Creek. It was in the ledgers that she found the wound. The ranch's finances were recorded in a thick, leather-bound book filled with Silas's strong but untidy script. He had given it to her so she could track her kitchen expenses. But Annalise, by nature, could not look at a single column of numbers without wanting to understand the whole page. Late at night, in the quiet of her small cabin with Peter asleep on the cot, she would study the book by the light of a single oil lamp. She started with her own domain: flour, sugar, salt, coffee, canned goods. At first, she was simply trying to be more efficient, to see where she could stretch a dollar. But as she cross-referenced the entries for the past year, a pattern began to emerge. The prices from Henderson's Mercantile in town were not just high, they were erratically high. A sack of flour that cost $3 one month would cost $3.50 the next, then drop to $3.20, with no discernible logic. The fluctuations seemed small, but she had a mind for accumulation. She began a new ledger, a small notebook of her own. With neat, precise penmanship, she copied the figures, organized them by item, and calculated the averages. Then she did something Silas had never thought to do. She found an old mail order catalog from a wholesaler in Helena that had been used as a doorstop in the bunkhouse. It was 6 months out of date, but it provided a baseline. The discrepancy was shocking. Even accounting for freight costs, Henderson's Mercantile was overcharging the Blackwood Ranch by at least 20%, and on some items, closer to 30%. The small, random-seeming price hikes were a deliberate camouflage for a systematic and predatory practice. Over the course of a year, the theft amounted to hundreds of dollars. It was money Silas Blackwood, with his worn-out equipment and his constant struggle to make payroll, could not afford to lose. It was a slow, steady bleeding of his livelihood. She sat back from the small table, the numbers stark on the page before her. This was more than just a business problem. It was a betrayal. Henderson, the store's owner, was someone Silas spoke of as a fixture in the valley, a man he'd known for years. Presenting this information required care. She was an employee, an outsider. Accusing a local merchant of thievery was a serious charge, and a direct criticism of Silas's own management. She spent another night verifying her calculations, preparing her case as if for a tribunal. She would not present accusations. She would present facts. The next evening, after the kitchen was clean and the men had retired, she walked to the main house and knocked on the door. Silas opened it, a look of surprise on his face. She rarely came to the house. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, "forgive the intrusion, but may I have a moment of your time? It concerns the household accounts." He hesitated, then stepped back, gesturing her inside. The house was much like Silas himself, stark, clean, and carrying an air of deep loneliness. A fire burned low in the stone hearth. A rifle rested on a rack over the mantel, next to a small, faded photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes. Martha. "What is it?" he asked, his tone wary. Instead of speaking, Annalise laid her small notebook on the heavy oak table next to his own sprawling ledger. She opened it to the page where her analysis was laid out in neat columns. I have been reviewing the supply costs for the past year, as you asked, she said quietly. I believe I have found a discrepancy. Silas picked up the notebook. His eyebrows drew together as he looked at her precise script, so different from his own. He followed the columns, his finger tracing the numbers. He saw the comparisons, the averages, the final damning total at the bottom of the page. He then turned to the Helena catalog, which she had also brought, open to the relevant page. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Annalise stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. She watched his face harden, the lines around his mouth deepening. He was not angry at her. He was a man seeing a trusted map and suddenly realizing it had been leading him into a swamp all along. Henderson, he said, the name a knot of gravel in his throat. He looked up from the notebook, his gray eyes meeting hers. The skepticism he usually held was gone, replaced by a raw, cold fury. And something else. Respect. Deep, profound respect. I never saw it. I looked at the numbers, but I never saw it. The amounts were small each time, Annalise said softly. It was designed to be overlooked. He's been doing this for years, Silas murmured, more to himself than to her. He sank into a chair at the table, the ledgers spread before him like evidence of a crime. All those times I was short for the farrier, or had to sell off a few head early. It was him, bleeding me dry, a quarter at a time. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, not as a cook or a governess, but as an equal. How did you see it? It is my nature to put things in order, she said simply. Disorder in numbers is the same as disorder in a pantry. It is a sign that something is wrong. He shook his head slowly, a grim smile touching his lips for a second. I hired you to bake biscuits, Mrs. Vogel. My name is Annalise, she said, the first time she had offered it. The use of her given name hung in the air between them, a quiet intimacy in the lonely house. Annalise, he repeated, testing the sound of it. You have done this ranch a service far beyond baking biscuits. He closed her notebook and pushed it gently back toward her. His anger at Henderson was still there, a hot coal in his chest, but it was now overlaid with a powerful sense of gratitude. This woman, this stranger he had almost turned away, had just handed him a weapon. She had shown him where the enemy was, and it wasn't in the weather or the price of beef, but in the smiling, treacherous face of a man he thought was a neighbor. The next day, Silas rode into Prospect Creek. He was gone for hours. Annalise went about her work, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had set a stone rolling, and she did not know where it would stop. He returned at dusk, his face grim but set with a new resolve. He didn't say what had happened in town, but that evening, a wagon from a different freight company arrived, laden with supplies from a town 30 miles further down the road. And when Billy returned from his own errands, he reported that a furious shouting match had been heard coming from Henderson's mercantile, culminating in Silas declaring his business would never again darken Henderson's door. That night, Silas came to the cookhouse as Annalise was finishing her cleaning. He placed a small cloth-bound book on the table. It was a copy of David Copperfield. I saw it in the window of the other mercantile, he said, not looking at her. I thought, the boy, Peter. You might read it to him. Annalise picked up the book. It was the first gift she had received in over a year. It was more than a book. It was an acknowledgement. It was gratitude. It was the beginning of a trust that went far beyond the boundaries of employer and employee. Thank you, Silas, she said softly. He just nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned and limped back into the darkness. Annalise held the book to her chest. The walls around Silas Blackwood were not just cracked now. A gate had been opened, just wide enough for a quiet woman with honest eyes to see through. And the fortress, she realized, was not the only thing he was trying to protect. He was protecting a deep and profound loneliness he was only just beginning to realize he no longer had to bear alone. The severing of ties with Henderson's mercantile was not without consequence. Henderson, it turned out, was not merely a greedy merchant. He was a man with connections and a vindictive streak. And his closest associate was Jedediah Thorne, the owner of the sprawling T-Bar ranch that bordered Blackwood's property to the east. Thorne was a man whose ambition was as vast as the land he coveted. He had been watching Silas's struggles for years, waiting for the right moment to pounce, to absorb the smaller, water-rich ranch into his own burgeoning empire. The crooked supply deal had been part of his strategy, a slow, patient siege designed to weaken Silas from within. Annalise had not just exposed a cheat, she had disrupted a conspiracy. Thorne did not wait long to retaliate. His first move was subtle. A section of fence along the shared property line was cut, allowing 24 of Thorne's cattle to wander onto Blackwood's grazing land, muddying a spring and consuming precious grass. It was an old rancher's trick, an act of petty aggression designed to provoke. Silas and his men spent a full day rounding up the strays and mending the fence, their jaws tight with resentment. But Thorne's real attack was far more insidious. As the first snows of autumn began to dust the high peaks, a man on a fine-looking horse delivered an official-looking envelope to Silas. Inside was a legal notice. Jedediah Thorne was calling in a debt, an old loan of $1,000, taken out by Silas's father 20 years earlier, for which Thorne now held the note. According to the document, the loan was due in full, with accumulated interest within 30 days. If it was not paid, Thorne would place a lien on the ranch and begin foreclosure proceedings. Silas stood on his porch, the paper trembling in his hand. $1,000. He might as well have been asked for the moon. He had maybe 200 in cash, saved for emergencies. The rest of his capital was on the hoof, in the cattle he wouldn't be able to sell until the spring drive. Thorne knew this. He had timed his attack perfectly, striking in the lean season, between the last of the summer income and the promise of the next. The news spread through the ranch like a winter chill. The improved morale evaporated, replaced by a grim, familiar anxiety. The men knew what foreclosure meant: the end of the Blackwood Ranch, the loss of their jobs, the dispersal of the small community they had formed. Silas retreated into himself, the walls he had allowed to crumble hastily rebuilt, thicker than before. He spent his evenings poring over his father's old account books, his face a mask of desperation. He was certain the loan had been paid. His father had been a meticulous man, but he could find no record of it, no receipt, no canceled note. It was his word against Thorne's paper. As the 30-day deadline loomed, a brutal, early winter storm descended from the mountains. It came without warning, a blizzard that buried the world in a sea of white. The wind howled, a physical presence that shook the buildings and drove the snow into impenetrable drifts. The ranch was cut off, an isolated island in a frozen ocean. The road to Prospect Creek, and from there to the county seat, where any legal defense would have to be mounted, was impassable. The crisis reached its peak on the third day of the storm. Silas, driven by a desperate need to check on a group of pregnant heifers sheltering in a far pasture, insisted on riding out. Gus and Billy argued against it, but Silas was a man possessed by a frantic energy, a need to do something, anything, rather than sit and wait for the axe to fall. He returned 2 hours later, slumped over his horse's neck, barely conscious. The horse, a steady old gelding, had brought him home. His face was ashen, and his right leg was bent at an unnatural angle. In the blinding whiteout, his horse had stepped into a snow-covered ditch. Silas had been thrown, his already bad hip shattering on the frozen ground. They carried him into the house and laid him on his bed. He was delirious with pain. Annalise, her face pale but her hands steady, took charge. She had some knowledge of healing, learned from her mother and honed by necessity. She sent Billy to the bunkhouse for splints and clean linen. With Gus's help, she cut away Silas's trouser leg. The injury was severe. "The bone is broken clean through," she said, her voice low and clinical, masking her fear. "We have to set it, or he'll lose the leg." Gus nodded grimly. Under her calm, clear instructions, they did the brutal work. They forced the bone back into alignment, the sound a sickening crunch that made Billy turn away, his face green. Silas screamed, a raw, terrible sound that was quickly swallowed by the howling wind outside. Then he passed out. They splinted and bound the leg as tightly as they could, then covered him with every blanket in the house. Annalise sat by his bedside, wiping his feverish brow with a cool cloth. The ranch was now utterly leaderless. Silas, the pillar of the entire operation, was broken and helpless. The snow continued to fall, burying them deeper with every hour. The foreclosure deadline was less than a week away. Jedediah Thorne's victory seemed not just likely, but preordained by a cruel and indifferent God. Outside, the world was a void of swirling white. Inside the lonely ranch house, a quiet Dutch governess sat vigil, the full weight of the ranch's survival settling onto her shoulders. She looked at the helpless man in the bed, his face etched with pain, even in unconsciousness. She looked at the legal notice, which had fallen to the floor, a stark black-and-white declaration of their doom. Despair was a luxury. Panic was a waste of energy. What was left was the work. There was always the work. And Annalise Vogel was about to take charge. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. The world shrank to the confines of the snow-banked buildings of the Blackwood Ranch. The wind's scream was a constant accompaniment to their lives, a reminder of their isolation and vulnerability. But inside, a new kind of order was taking hold. With Silas incapacitated, the vacuum of leadership was filled not by panic, but by Annalise's quiet, unshakable competence. She did not issue commands like a general. She simply did what needed to be done, and her calm purposefulness became the new center of gravity around which the others orbited. Her first priority was Silas. She tended to his fever, forced broth between his lips when he was lucid, and kept a constant watch on his mangled leg, praying for the swelling to go down and for infection not to set in. Her second priority was the men and the animals. She ensured the cookhouse remained a bastion of warmth and sustenance, providing hot, energy-rich meals that kept the men's strength up for the grueling work of digging out pathways, reinforcing the barn against the wind, and ensuring the cattle had feed and water. She organized the dwindling supplies with ruthless efficiency, calculating exactly how long they could last. Her calm demeanor was infectious. The men, seeing her work tirelessly from before dawn until long after dark, found their own reserves of strength and resolve. They stopped looking at the snow with despair and started looking at her with a kind of awe. On the 5th night of the storm, with the wind finally beginning to subside, Annalise sat by Silas's bedside. He was asleep, his breathing shallow but even. The fever had broken. The immediate crisis of his health had passed, but the larger crisis of the ranch's survival loomed larger than ever. The foreclosure deadline was now only a few days away. She looked around the room, her gaze falling on a large, dusty trunk at the foot of Silas's bed. It was his father's trunk, filled with old papers, deeds, and memories that Silas had never had the heart to sort through. He had mentioned it once, in a moment of frustration, saying he was sure the proof of the loan's payment was in there somewhere, lost in a sea of forgotten history. An idea, born of desperation and her own methodical nature, took root. She looked at the sleeping man, at his helpless form under the blankets. He could not search, but she could. She dragged the heavy trunk closer to the firelight. It was unlocked. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. The scent of old paper and dry leather filled the air. It was a jumble of documents: land grants from the territorial government, bills of sale for long-dead bulls, letters from relatives back east, yellowed newspaper clippings. It was a lifetime of a family's history pressed between layers of dust. For anyone else, it would have been an impossible task. For Annalise, it was an exercise in order. She began to work, not with frantic haste, but with the same patient methodology she applied to everything. She created piles on the floor, deeds and legal papers in one, correspondence in another, financial records in a third. She worked through the night, her eyes burning from the dim lamplight, her fingers smudged with ink and dust. Peter, wrapped in a blanket, slept on a small cot she had made for him near the fire. She found the original loan agreement with Thorne's father easily enough. It was dated 22 years prior, but there was no corresponding receipt, no note of cancellation. She sifted through stacks of bank statements and cancelled checks, her heart sinking with each one that proved irrelevant. Thorne was right. Silas's father had been meticulous, but this one crucial document was missing. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the window, her fingers brushed against a small, hard-backed book at the very bottom of the trunk. It was not a ledger, it was a diary. The entries were in the precise, elegant hand of Silas's mother. It was a daily record of household life, of weather, of visitors, of small joys and sorrows. Annalise almost set it aside as irrelevant, but something made her pause. She opened it to the year the loan was taken. She scanned the entries, her tired eyes flying over descriptions of canning peaches and a new dress pattern. Then she found it. An entry dated in the spring, a year after the loan was made. Abel rode to the Thorne place today. A difficult trip, as the creek is high. He took the cash from the 2 prize bulls we sold at the fair. He said it was a blessing to be finally free of that debt, and that old Manasseh Thorne was a difficult man to settle with, but honest enough to sign the note, paid in full, directly on the back when presented with the cash. Abel was so proud. He tucked the note into his copy of Pilgrim's Progress for safekeeping. He always said a man's most valuable papers should rest alongside his most valuable principles. Annalise's heart hammered against her ribs. Pilgrim's Progress. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the sparse furnishings. There, on a small shelf above Silas's bed, sat a handful of books. A Bible, a book of poetry, and a worn, leather-bound copy of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Her hands trembled as she took it down. The book was old, the pages fragile. She opened it carefully. Tucked between the pages describing Christian's journey out of the Slough of Despond was a folded piece of paper. It was the original loan document, and on the back, in faded but still legible ink, was a short signed declaration. Paid in full, April 17th, 1868. Manasseh Thorne. Jedediah Thorne was not just collecting a debt. He was committing fraud. He was using a copy of the note, banking on the fact that the original, with its crucial endorsement, was lost to time. Annalise sank into the chair, the document clutched in her hand. Victory. It was not a victory won with a gun or with force, but with patience, with order, and with the quiet memory of a long-dead woman. She had found the one thing that could save them. The blizzard broke the next day. The world emerged clean and white and silent under a brilliant sun. And with the thaw came Jedediah Thorne. He rode up to the ranch house in the late afternoon, accompanied by the county sheriff, a portly man with a self-important air. Thorne's face was smug, confident. He had come to deliver the final blow. Gus met them on the porch, his shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. "Blackwood's in no condition for visitors," he said, his voice a low growl. "That's a shame," Thorne said, dismounting. "But business is business. The deadline on the note has passed. Sheriff, we're here to post the foreclosure notice." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Jedediah, maybe we should give him another day on account of the storm." "The law is the law," Thorne snapped. "The man defaulted." Just then, the door to the house opened. Annalise stepped out. She was wearing her simple apron, and her hair was pinned up as neatly as always. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice calm and even. "Mr. Blackwood is unwell, but he asked me to handle his affairs." Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound. "He's sending his cook to do a man's business? This is beyond you, little lady. Step aside." Annalise did not move. She looked at the sheriff. "Sheriff Miller, before you post any notices, perhaps you should examine this document. It is the original loan agreement between Abel Blackwood and Manasseh Thorne." She unfolded the paper and held it out. The sheriff, his curiosity piqued, took it. He read the front, then turned it over. His eyes widened as he saw the signed endorsement on the back. He looked from the paper to Thorne, his expression changing from unease to suspicion. "Jedediah," the sheriff said slowly, "this note is marked paid in full, signed by your own father." The smug look on Thorne's face vanished, replaced by a ghastly pale shock. He stared at the paper in the sheriff's hand as if it were a snake. That's a forgery," he stammered, his voice suddenly shrill. "Is it?" Annalise asked quietly. "I also have Silas's mother's diary, which details the day the loan was paid, the source of the funds, and the exact location where this document was stored for safekeeping. I imagine a court would find it very compelling testimony." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Attempting to collect on a settled debt, using what must be a fraudulent copy of the note. I believe that is a serious crime, Sheriff." The sheriff looked at Thorne, his face hardening. He was a political animal, and he could smell which way the wind was now blowing. Jedediah Thorne, one of the most powerful men in the valley, had just been exposed as a common cheat in front of one of his own men and a Blackwood ranch hand. Thorne's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. He looked at Annalise, at the quiet, unshakable woman who had single-handedly dismantled his entire scheme. He saw no triumph in her eyes, only a calm, factual certainty that was more galling than any gloating. He had been defeated not by a rival rancher, but by a bookish governess. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice venomous. "Oh, I think it is, Jedediah," the sheriff said, his tone now cold as ice. He handed the precious document back to Annalise. "Seems to me you've got some explaining to do back in town. Attempting to defraud? That's a felony." Thorne stared at him, speechless. He saw the contempt in the sheriff's eyes, saw the flicker of understanding on Gus's face. His power, built on intimidation and the illusion of wealth, was crumbling. His reputation in the valley was ruined. Without another word, he wrenched his horse's reins, mounted, and galloped away, his retreat a cloud of churned-up snow and shame. The sheriff cleared his throat, looking embarrassed. "My apologies, Mom. Tell Silas. Tell him I'm glad this is sorted out." He tipped his hat, a gesture of profound respect, and rode off, leaving the ranch in a sudden, profound silence. Annalise stood on the porch, the paper still in her hand. The sun was warm on her face. From inside the house she heard a faint sound, Silas, calling her name. She turned and went back inside, leaving the defeated enemy and the vast, quiet landscape behind. The crisis was over. The climax had not been a gunshot, but the rustle of a 20-year-old piece of paper. And the victory belonged to the capable outsider who had just saved her home. The aftermath of Thorne's defeat was as quiet as the climax itself. Word of his attempted fraud spread through the valley like wildfire, carried by the sheriff and a talkative deputy. Thorne's reputation, once a pillar of his power, crumbled into dust. Men who had feared him now scorned him. Banks that had extended him credit began to call in their own notes. His empire, built on a foundation of deceit, began to collapse under its own weight. The threat was not just neutralized, it was annihilated by the simple, undeniable power of the truth. On the Blackwood Ranch, the atmosphere was one of quiet jubilation. The men walked with a lighter step, their conversations in the bunkhouse full of renewed hope. They looked at Annalise with a mixture of reverence and affection. She was no longer the Dutch governess or the cook. She was the woman who had saved them all. Frank, the former antagonist, was now her most fervent admirer, loudly proclaiming her genius to anyone who would listen. Silas's recovery was slow and painful, but his spirit, which had been as broken as his hip, began to mend much faster. Annalise tended to him with a gentle professional care that slowly chipped away the last of his defenses. He would watch her as she moved about the room, changing his bandages, bringing him food, or sitting quietly by the fire in the evenings, reading to Peter from the book he had given her. Peter, in the newfound security of the ranch, had begun to blossom. He still spoke little, but his silence was no longer born of trauma. It was the quiet of a contemplative child. He started to draw, using charcoal sticks on scraps of paper Annalise procured for him. His pictures were of the ranch, the horses, the cattle, the leaning barn, and always the figures of his mother and the man in the bed. One evening, about 2 weeks after Thorne's retreat, Silas was finally able to sit up in a chair by the fire, his splintered leg propped on a stool. Annalise was darning one of his shirts, her hands moving in a steady, rhythmic dance. Peter was on the floor, drawing. The quiet in the room was comfortable, domestic. "Annalise," Silas said, his voice still rough but clear. She looked up, her needle poised. "Yes, Silas?" He looked at his hands, large and calloused, now resting uselessly in his lap. "When I hired you," he began, his words slow and deliberate, "I told you the pay was room and board. I told you it was temporary." "I remember," she said softly. "I was wrong," he said, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. His eyes, the color of creek stones, were clear of all their old suspicion. They held a deep, unguarded vulnerability. "This ranch wouldn't exist today if you hadn't come here. You saved it. Not just from Thorne. You saved it from me, from the mess I had let it become." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I hired a cook because I needed someone to feed my men. What I got was a partner who could see what I couldn't, who could fight a battle I didn't even know how to wage. What I got," he said, his voice dropping, "was the heart of this place back." Annalise did not stop his confession with false modesty. She listened, her own heart full, recognizing the monumental effort it took for this proud, wounded man to speak so plainly. "The arrangement we have is no longer fair," he continued. "This is not a job, not anymore. This place, it's as much yours as it is mine. I want to make you a full partner, your name on the deed, next to mine. An equal share in everything, the work, the risks, and whatever profits we can manage to build from here on out." It was not a proposal of marriage, not in words, but it was a proposal of a life, a shared future. It was an offer of permanence, a word he had once banished. He was offering her a home, not as a guest or an employee, but as its rightful co-owner. He was giving her the one thing she had lost, The one thing she had crossed a continent to find. A place to belong. She looked at him, at his earnest, hopeful face. She looked at her son, safe and content on the floor. She looked around the simple, rugged room that had become her sanctuary. She had arrived here with nothing but her own competence and a desperate will to survive. She had not been looking for a partnership, only for shelter. But here, in this harsh and beautiful land, with this quiet, broken man, she had found something more. She had found a place where her competence was not just useful, but essential. Where her nature was not just accepted, but celebrated. Yes, she said, the word a simple, profound acceptance. Yes, Silas, I accept. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his weary features. It was like seeing the sun break over a mountain ridge after a long, dark night. At that moment, Peter looked up from his drawing. He held it up for them to see. It was a picture of the ranch house. On the porch stood 4 figures, crudely drawn but unmistakable. A tall man with a cane, a woman with blonde hair, a small boy, and a horse. Home, Peter said, the word clear and distinct in the quiet room. It was the first word he had spoken in months. Annalise felt tears well in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. She went to her son and hugged him tightly. Over his small shoulder, her eyes met Silas's. His were also shining. In the shared glance, a promise was made and a future was sealed. The found family was complete. Music. Several months passed. Spring came to the high country, a miracle of green grass and wildflowers pushing up through the melting snow. The Blackwood Ranch, now legally the Blackwood Vogel Ranch, was thriving. With Annalise managing the books and Silas, now walking with the aid of a sturdy cane, managing the cattle, the operation ran with a newfound efficiency and purpose. The loan they took out to buy new breeding stock, a loan from a different bank in a different town, was granted without hesitation. The ranch's reputation, once shadowed by struggle, was now one of integrity and resilience. The final scene unfolds on a warm evening in early summer. The sun is setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The air is sweet with the smell of clover and damp earth. Inside the ranch house, which has been subtly transformed by Annalise's touch with curtains on the windows and a pot of geraniums on the sill, a quiet domestic rhythm plays out. Annalise is at the large oak table, but she is not poring over ledgers. She is kneading a batch of dough, her hands moving with a familiar, comforting rhythm. The scent of yeast fills the warm kitchen. Her face is serene, the old lines of worry and desperation completely erased, replaced by a quiet contentment. Peter sits at the other end of the table. He is no longer silent. He chatters away to his mother, a steady stream of questions and observations about his day helping Billy with a new foal. He is sketching in a proper drawing book, a gift from Gus, his pictures now full of life and color. Silas sits in a sturdy rocking chair by the open door, looking out at the land that is his, that is theirs. The ever-present pain in his hip has eased to a dull, manageable ache. He is not watching the cattle or scanning the horizon for threats. He is watching the woman and the boy in his kitchen. He watches the way the last light of the day catches the gold in Annalise's hair. He listens to the sound of Peter's laughter, a sound he now realizes his lonely house had been starving for. A feeling of profound peace, so alien to him for so long, has settled deep in his bones. It is the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. He had thought, in his darkest years, that a ranch needed a strong hand, a fierce will, and a heart walled off from the pain of the world. He had tried to be that man, and he had nearly lost everything. The ranch had not needed another hardened fighter to save it from ruin. What it got, and what it truly needed, was the quiet, capable heart that had made it a home.